Well, good morning and welcome to today's episode of Transformed. Today I want to talk to you about a promise kept.
Welcome to today's message with Pastor Jim Balzano.
As always, I want to take a moment, thank Park Home for our studio furniture, and thank Taylor Design and Events for this designing of our studio. Let me tell you about a story of a man who kept a promise. It's a man by the name of Mitsuaki Amada. It's a poignant tale of compassion that has crossed former enemy lines and generations. It's the 85-year-old lifelong quest to fulfill his father's dying wish to find the families of American airmen shot down over Japan and listed as missing in action, and it spans 70 years. It began in a Tokyo farm field on the night of April 2nd, 1945, when Amada, then 16 years old, and his father crouched at the entrance of their homemade bomb shelter, watching a squadron of American B-29 bombers overhead. And what happened next changed their lives forever. Suddenly, one of the B-29 bombers, downed by an anti-aircraft fire, plunged into their field just meters from where the father and son had shelter. Laden with bombs, the inferno killed all 11 crewmen, including a 21-year-old airman from Illinois, Left Gunner Wallace J. Pitts. The crew were listed as missing in action, and families back home in the United States were left to grieve without knowledge about the final moments of their loved ones' lives. Then, that's where the journey began. Even though the two countries were still at war, Amada's father decided that the unknown airman should be laid to rest with dignity. It was out of respect for a fellow human, even the enemy, his father said. And so the pair gathered the remains of the airman and placed him in their own ancestral cemetery. Later, after the war ended, the United States military reburied the remains in a military cemetery in Yokohama. But for Amada's father, that wasn't enough. He asked Mitsuaki to find the airmen's families and to give them closure and let them know where and how their loved ones had died. And so began his lifelong quest, spanning 2 generations and language barriers. It became a mission of humanity, of building bridges, and for the families concerned, long-awaited closure. Amada traveled to the United States to find relatives and information and painstakingly tracked down each family. 70 years later, in 2015, Bill Pitts and his wife Brenda were the final American family to visit the crash site on the outskirts of Tokyo to pay their respects at a monument built by Amada. They said, "Somebody came out with love to bury the remains of these men. It's amazing," Pitts said. Finally, seeing his uncle's name inscribed on Amada's monument, it deeply moved Bill Pitts. "It just surprises me that I was tearing up, and I didn't expect that," he said. "How many times can I say thank you? Will it ever be enough? I don't know, but I'm trying to say thank you." For Amada, that last heartfelt thank you ended 7 decades of searching. He said, "My mission is finally complete." It's an amazing story. Just before he died, Amada's father wrote his last thoughts about the event that changed his son's life. The words are now carved into the U.S. Airmen's Monument to pray for the peace of human beings and the world and console the spirits of courageous 11 U.S. crew members of the bomber B-29, which crashed on this spot during the last World War. I have erected this monument to wish that these 11 brave men should sleep here peacefully forever. And so it was 70 years of a man searching and finding the families of these 11 airmen in order to keep the promise to his father. It's an amazing story. Well, the other night I was watching a documentary on the exodus of Israel out of Egypt. It was a documentary that was to prove the veracity of the exodus. It was quite interesting. And as I watched it, though, something occurred to me. Something came up, and something I was reminded of. And I began to ask myself this question: what really was the Exodus? Yeah, we know what it was. We know, and those of us who understand and know what the Bible teaches, it was the moment where Moses led the people of Israel out of Egypt after hundreds of years of captivity, bondage, oppression. They were led out by God, a pillar of cloud by day, a pillar of fire by night, the parting of the Red Sea, all of the dynamic parts of that story we know about. But when I really began to break it down, I said, what is the actual Exodus story? And it dawned on me. You know what it was? It was a promise kept. It was a promise kept by God. Let me take you back to a scripture found in Genesis chapter 15. It says, now when the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram. And behold, terror and great darkness fell upon him. Then God said to Abram, know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, where they will be enslaved and oppressed for 400 years. But I will also judge the nation whom they serve, and afterward they will come out with many possessions. As for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace, and you will be buried at a good old age. Then in the fourth generation, they will return here, for the wrongdoing of the Amorite is not yet complete. Man, I remember that and I read that scripture. The Exodus was God keeping his promise to Abram. We're talking hundreds of years later. God keeps his promise. You see, one of the things we have to understand and we got to remember in our own lives is that when God makes a promise, he intends to keep it. He doesn't make flippant promises. He doesn't just make them and not intend to keep them. Fortunately, he's not a man who sometimes makes a promise and doesn't keep it. But the fact is, when he makes that promise, he will keep his promise. You see, even whenever that promise doesn't come to pass, delay is certainly not denial. Delay doesn't mean it won't happen. Think about Abram. He's telling them right up front, this is what's going to happen. I'm making a promise to you, but that promise won't be fulfilled until after you're gone. The promise is as good as the one making the promise. And in this case, it was God making the promise. And because God made the promise was certain. And you think about this, when you read the scripture, all of the parts of that Exodus story were part of God keeping his promise to Abram. He said, this is what's going to happen. He told him, your people are going to be enslaved and in oppression. But I promise you, Abram, when they come out, they're going to come out with many possessions. The Bible tells us that they come out with gold, they come out with silver, they come out with fabric, they come out with all kinds of possessions. They did not leave Egypt poor because God promised that to Abram. And then he said, I will judge the nation that oppresses them. Do you understand the plagues that came upon Egypt were God's judgment that he promised to Abram? And then when he destroyed the armies of Pharaoh in that Red Sea, again, he was judging that nation because he had promised that would happen. And then all the things that happened, the crossing of the Red Sea, the waters of Marah, the manna that would come down, the quail that would come down, water from a rock. All of these things would happen in the course of God taking his people from Egypt to the promised land, the place promised to Abram. All these things. And so when we read it, our hearts should be encouraged that God always keeps his promises. And yet here's the intriguing thing about that. Abram had to believe it without seeing it. And he had to believe for it, and really would never be realized in his lifetime. Here's what I want to leave you with today. God still makes promises. His scripture, his word, is full of promises. And there are times those promises speak right into our life. And there's times where God makes promises to us in our prayer time, and he speaks things to us. And some of you, I want to encourage you today that you haven't perhaps seen the promise fulfilled yet. You know what? God keeps his promises. The Exodus is a promise kept. It might be in delay. It might take years. It might even be kept after you're dead. But the fact is, God will keep his promise. And so let me encourage you this week. Stand firm. Believe the promise. Believe God. And one day, that promise will be kept. Have a great week.